So I had to keep the part in there about the fact that I was a journalist before I came into the legal profession for two reasons. One, I'm very excited to be at the National Press Club today, to be invited, thank you very much. And two, to make crystal clear that I am not an engineer. So I am here to give you the policy landscape in the hopes that if you have really technical questions, all of the other very smart people in the room can help you out. So kicking off today, and we can go to the next slide with the overview, we wanted to touch today a little bit on just some of the lead agencies and the regulators who are involved in the space. We'll dig into a number of recent spectrum developments, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of what we'll see for the remainder of 2023 as well. You'll see that I will mostly focus on the mid-band frequencies, largely because they've been a pretty substantial area of focus, obviously, of late, given the coverage and capacity. Not to say that low band and high band are not important and that there aren't a lot of activities ongoing there, but in the interest of time, those will mostly be the bands that I'll be sticking with. And then again, we'll wrap up the discussion with what's coming down the pike. So in terms of lead agencies and regulators, I think you all are pretty familiar with the space. The FCC has four, and you can move to the next slide now. The FCC has four folks on the dais today. The FCC chairwoman, she is actually the first woman to lead in a permanent capacity of the agency. One other Democratic commissioner, Commissioner Starks, and then two Republicans. You will see that there continues to be one vacancy, though, which has been there throughout the Biden administration, now going on 28 months. We previously had at least one nominee, Gigi Sohn, who folks might have been following in the press. She was nominated back in October of 2021. Her nomination was reported out of committee on a 14-14 party line split. It was actually the first time that somebody was not unanimously reported out of committee. So there was a lot, variety of both personal and policy-related criticism of her. She would have actually been the first openly LGBTQ commissioner on the FCC dais, but she did officially withdraw her nomination as of March of this year. So we're hearing lots of rumors about what might come next. I know Ana Gomez, who was named to be the head of delegation for the US at the WRC, has been sort of the leading contender that folks have heard about. So we might see some additional activity on that potentially this month. I am procrastinating based on what I've heard in the press as well, but hopefully we will see at least that fifth commissioner there, which is very likely to then give more activity and more ability for the FCC to move forward on a number of issues. On the NTIA side, obviously NTIA very much a key player in making sure that the executive branch's positions on spectrum policy are coordinated. Alan Davidson has been leading up the agency since January of last year. He had a number of substantial roles in the communication space over his decades of his career, with actually a large emphasis on broadband deployment as well, which I think is pretty particularly beneficial in terms of NTIA's role in the BEAD program rollout and the broadband equity and adoption. And then on the Office of Spectrum Management side, Charles Cooper, he's been there since 2019. You all might be very familiar with Charles, decades of experience, particularly in RF engineering. He served in the Enforcement Bureau for quite some time before heading over to NTIA, so lots of good experience there. He is also managing not only the National Spectrum Strategy, but he's also leading up the agency's efforts on the WRC as well. And I should note, not up there, but Scott Blake Harris, who came over to NTIA about a year ago, is a key player. He's the lead spectrum policy advisor for the administrator's office, managing substantial parts of the national spectrum strategy. So I know you all are bringing him in tomorrow, and it'll be a good opportunity to say hello to him as well. There are quite a few other agencies, and I think the more that we look at spectrum policy, the more agencies realize that they have equities in the process. Congress obviously is particularly important. They have the power of the purse in terms of getting the funding to the agencies, to FCC and NTIA and others, but they are also very influential in a number of spectrum-related policies, including auction authority, which is something that we'll touch on here in a little bit. The White House as well has a role to play, particularly when there are spats that need to be resolved or they need a heavy hand to take a look at. The FAA C-band coexistence issue last year was a particular one that the White House had to step in on. Department of Defense, also increasingly important player. They have a substantial amount of spectrum in the mid-band range. So as we look to find opportunities for repurposing or sharing in the mid-band frequencies, the DoD is certainly a lead voice in those discussions. And then again, the Department of Transportation, lots of equities as well. The C-band example is just one of them. We know there have been lots of discussions on the L-band as well, which we'll have a panel on later today, but definitely equities as part of that. Also in the 5.9 gigahertz band and the Intelligent Transportation Systems rollout. And then other agencies as well, Department of Energy, obviously, as we look to our smart grids. You have a number of agencies involved in spectrum siting issues, Department of Interior and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So a number of players that have to be coordinated, and certainly glad that NTIA is there to help wrangle some of those positions in the various policies. So that's sort of the background of where we are. I think what I'd like to do now is spend a bulk of my time talking about some of the recent spectrum developments within the last year. There's lots to talk about, so I'll do as much as I can in the time that I have. This will be mostly perspectives from the fixed and mobile perspective, the wireless perspective. Again, lots of other equities, lots of other bands, low band, high band as well. But the trends that you'll see as part of this really are in terms of the efforts to make more spectrum available for 5G, for advanced 5G, and for 6G, and then also efforts to spur that more intensive use for exactly what you all do, which is to help manage those airwaves. And you'll see that as I organize it, I'm just going to go up the bands for ease of kind of following along. So starting with 2.5, this one here, as folks know, has a number of existing educational broadcast system licensees in the band, educational broadband system licensees. And in 2022, the FCC had about 1 month of bidding between July and August that resulted in about $428 million in gross bids for overlay licenses in the band. So this is making available those overlay licenses on top of the 2,000 or so EBS. Nearly all of the licenses were purchased, and these were in 3 blocks, 2 at about 50 megahertz apiece, and then 1 at 17.5. These are 10-year renewable licenses. Now, the FCC, in terms of getting these licenses out there for use, they have so far issued 3 grants of licenses. And as of the beginning of March, there were 62 out of 63 of the winning bidders had substantially most of their licenses already granted. The FCC granted about 700 or so of those licenses. The one left is the one that has the bulk of the licenses, which is T-Mobile. T-Mobile purchased about 91% of the available licenses in that auction, and so far has not been issued those licenses. And you'll note the timing of that. The last grant that we had coming out of the FCC was March 1st. The FCC's auction authority expired on March 9th. And so there is a very, very substantial ongoing debate amongst even former general counsels of the FCC weighing in on what exactly is the authority of the FCC to move forward in issuing those licenses now that they don't have that grant of authority. So that remains to be seen. I think folks are looking for the FCC to hopefully weigh in and for the general counsel's office to hopefully weigh in and certainly to try to get those additional licenses out into the marketplace. Next up is lower 3 gigahertz. I could spend an entire 45 minutes talking about everything that's going on with this band. This is an extremely important band segment, as I'm sure you all know, for a number of reasons. It is directly adjacent to the 3.45 band that we'll talk about in a second that was successfully auctioned about a year ago. It's also part of a globally harmonized band segment. Bands N77 and N78 cover 3.3 to 4.2, and about 80% of global mid-band 5G operations happen, 80% of 5G operations happen in this mid-band segment. So it's a substantial chunk of spectrum that has an opportunity for global harmonization. It's also a chunk of spectrum that has DoD equities. We have federal radar systems here that are both ground-based, ship-based, and aeronautical, and so it's creating existing questions about what could be the potential for coexistence in that band. Congress did weigh in, though, to require a study of the band. So 3.1 to 3.45 is currently being investigated as part of a provision of the 2021 IIJA, the Infrastructure and Investment Act. There is a provision in there that requires DoD, in coordination with Commerce and HASC and SASC, the Senate and Armed Services and House Armed Services Committee, the White House, everybody kind of getting together and having a discussion about what is in the art of the possible for this band. with a look particularly, and I'm actually going to read this language for a very specific reason, what could be made available on a shared basis between federal uses and non-federal commercial licensed, subject to flexible use. The reason I read that is because those operative words, could be shared, have become a very, very clear point of contention in this band. What is the definition of sharing in terms of this particular band, and how can it be done? DOD is viewing sharing for purposes of this band and for others as not including any repacking and no relocation. So that is very different than what we've seen in other bands, AWS 3, for instance, even what we saw in 3.45. And so having that marker down about what is sharing and having it be much more cabined than what we've seen before is creating a pretty robust dialogue into then whether or not it actually can be shared. So in terms of next steps for this band, DOD is required to put out its report by August 15th of this year. And then there was a discussion about, to the extent that there are any segments that could be made available for an auction. That auction happens sometime between November of 2024 and November of 2027. I should note there as well one other piece in addition to the very cabined definition of sharing. There is also a trump card for DOD in this legislation. In terms of once the DOD report is out and the potential frequencies are then identified for potential auctioned use, DOD still has the opportunity to determine that the frequencies, whether or not the frequencies rather, would impact the primary mission of military spectrum users. So they do still have an additional trump card beyond that report as well. And I look forward to all of the legal authorities trying to figure out what primary mission means in DoD context. Next up is 3.45, again, immediately adjacent. This was an important band that had quite a bit of activity in the 2020 through 2022 timeframe. We saw in late in 2019, the FCC actually opened an inquiry into the proceeding to take a look at what portions could be made available. NTIA had previously identified the top 100, the 3.45 to 3.55 as potential for exclusive licensed use, and the White House actually put together the America's Midband Initiative Team, AMBIT, to do exactly that, to coordinate with DoD and figure out how to make that 100 megahertz swath available. Right around the same time, Congress passed what was called the Beat China for 5G Act. It was a requirement that the FCC auction that 100 megahertz by the end of 2021. So putting down that marker, the FCC moved forward, coordinated with DoD and NTIA and some of the cross-purposing with the AMBIT team as well, to make that 100 megahertz of spectrum available on a predominantly cleared basis, full power, and that is available now today after the auction, which brought in, I think, $22 billion, with about 14 of that being made available for relocation costs for the federal users. I say predominantly cleared because there are these new areas called cooperative planning areas and periodic use areas in that band. So this would be considered a sharing framework for all intents and purposes, but it is geographic-based sharing, and it has a temporal component as well with the periodic use areas. So there are about 30 of those where if your license is in one of those areas, you do have to coordinate with DoD. And one other note at the bottom of that slide, sorry to go back, is the secondary radio location operations that were in the band. This one is interesting because secondary users typically do not get reimbursed when they are relocated out of a band. This was the first time that the FCC is actually requiring reimbursement of those radio location licenses out of the 3.45 to 3.55 segment. They're actually being moved down to 2.9. NBC Universal and Nexstar were the licensees there. There were 5 licenses total. They indicated that it would be about $3 million to transition them, and the FCC took the equities in place of what those services did, how much it would cost, and said, let's go ahead and just fund the reimbursement. So there's a clearinghouse that's being set up today that is looking to finalize that process. C-band, also another one we could spend a ton of time on if we wanted to. So I think folks are pretty familiar with the C-band auction at this point. It was the highest grossing auction in FCC's history, about $80 billion. One fun fact, a single bidder actually single-handedly surpassed the FCC's prior record of AWS 3 winning bids. So the auction concluded in February of 2021. We have 2 phases of the clearing of that band, of the fixed satellite services that are moving up the band in above 3.98. Two phases here. The lower 100 megahertz of the segment 3.7 to 3.8 was cleared as of December of 2021 in 47 of the top 50 markets in the United States. The remainder of the band has to be cleared by the end of this year. And that is ongoing, but based on all of the status reports, the quarterly status reports that are provided, seems to be going on track and on schedule. I think the most pressing thing coming out of C-band today is the engagement with the FAA and the aviation industry on the concerns that were raised by those two entities with regard to the potential for harmful interference to radio altimeter operations in the 4.2 to 4.4 band. The FCC did consider this issue as part of the report and order that it adopted in 2020, indicated that the technical rules it adopted, as well as that 220 or more megahertz separation between the two services, would not cause harmful interference. Nevertheless, the concerns persisted. There was a report that came out from the aviation industry in the fall of 2020 that to date is predominantly where those concerns continue to lie. And so that has led to now years of engagement between the wireless industry and the aviation industry and the FAA and the FCC and the White House to move everything along so that the band could be made available, that the substantial amount of money that was spent on making that band available can be put to use, but that also those concerns raised by the FAA and the aviation industry are addressed. I think the prior conversation touched a little bit on receiver performance at the very end. I think this is exactly one of those issues. The radio altimeters that were developed for the 4.2 to 4.4 band were listening in to hundreds of megahertz below the band when they shouldn't have been, frankly, but there was nothing else near them when they were built. So it kind of comes down to those equities of what's there when you build it versus what happens when the spectral environment changes. So long story short, the conversations continue. The FAA has now some airworthiness directives that would require some actions on the parts of both the aviation industry, but then also takes advantage of some voluntary commitments that were made by the wireless industry. The four largest winning bidders in that auction have all committed to some continued measures in the FCC's docket, and the FAA is requiring retrofits of airplane radio altimeters by February of 2024. All right, so getting out of 3 gigahertz. 4.9 is next. This is one that I think folks are probably pretty familiar with over the years. We are now on the 7th report and order, I believe, so there's been a lot of activity on this one over the various years. But the FCC now has before it an order as well as a further notice of proposed rulemaking that is solidifying this segment as public safety spectrum, but it is also making it available on a preemptible basis for non-public safety uses. And what the FCC is doing here is it's adopting a band manager, which I believe is utilizing the Part 90 framework as opposed to the Part 101 framework in terms of the coordination. So there is an outstanding FNPRM that's taking a look at what exactly that band manager is going to do, how it's going to manage harmful interference or the potential for interference, and make sure that those public safety uses in the band continue to be the primary use, while also making the band available for critical infrastructure and other use cases. So the FCC adopted that order in January. The FNPRM comments are actually due tomorrow, so we should see continued activity on the development of the band manager there. Today, yes, they're due today, right. But tomorrow, see, I got you here. Tomorrow are the oppositions to the petition for reconsideration, which was filed seeking to eliminate the band plan altogether, eliminate the opportunity for these non-public safety uses, and to just solidify the 4.9 band as a public safety band. So more activity, I'm sure, to come on that one. Next up, we've got 5.9. So 5.9, also another long outstanding issue here. The FCC took a fresh look at this one back in 2020 to split the band after it had sat for a few decades as DSRC spectrum for intelligent transportation services that really never took hold. So the FCC took another look at the band and they ended up splitting that segment into two portions. The lower 45 megahertz is unlicensed, and now the upper 30 megahertz is used for cellular V2X technologies, or is being opened for that. There was litigation on this one, I think not surprisingly. State transportation authorities and amateur radio authorities took this one at issue, particularly related to the 45 megahertz for indoor use. And the DC Circuit actually upheld the FCC's decision-making on that one back in August, really deferring to the engineers over at the FCC on that front. petition for reconsideration as well. Again, this one actually with the automobile interests who are going to be leveraging the upper 30 megahertz for cellular V2X. They sought reconsideration of the out-of-band emissions limits from the unlicensed operations that might be going into the now C V2X band. So again, lots of activity, lots of equities on this particular portion. But I will note as well that as a couple of those pieces remain pending, the Commission also had an FNPRM on what exactly to do with the technical capabilities of those cellular V2X communications. This was a new type of intelligent transportation service, and so they need some additional technical rules. But in the meantime, they said they would allow for waivers to allow those technologies to roll out. Those waivers, while presented as expeditious, took about 2 years to get off the ground, but we did just see the first waiver order granted here back in April so that cellular V2X technologies can start to be certified and can start to be rolled out in the waiver states. So I think it's Virginia and Utah. And then likely more to come to the extent that folks can commit to the same. Once the FCC does adopt the FNPRM and adopts final rules, any of those waiver grantees will have to abide by those new FCC rules. Just up the band, have you all heard of the 6 gigahertz band? I feel like, no? Okay. They did a fantastic job discussing this earlier. I think Steve did a really great overview of what's going on in the band and a really good discussion about the AFC and sort of the capabilities here. So I won't touch too much on the top part of that. Obviously, we know it makes available 1,200 megahertz of spectrum for unlicensed use, continued conversations and concerns being raised by a number of entities on the fixed microwave side, the broadcast auxiliary, the FSS, and a number of other folks in terms of making sure that their operations continue to be protected. There does remain a petition for reconsideration on that, but I will note that in February of 2022, the DC Circuit did deny petitions for review on this one, with one exception, which was seeking to make available broadcast auxiliary uses or specific to that. And the FCC actually now has, I think, a pending notice on remand on that one. Moving, though, to the next one, a couple items just to highlight for folks that also remain outstanding. I think we heard a lot about the AFC implementation there. One of the things that the DC Circuit did focus on in its order was the fact that the Enforcement Bureau would be taking action to the extent that there was harmful interference. But it was interesting to hear on the last panel that that's still kind of up in the air, right, in terms of what that is going to look like. So I think that's one piece that the AFC implementation will be taking a look at, but among many others is the certification itself. So I think we heard previously we're getting into the testing phase here. We've got 13 entities that have been conditionally approved to be AFC coordinators. The FCC will move forward with that testing and potentially certification in the fall. Also, outstanding notices on client-to-client devices, seeking comment on whether to permit direct communications between client devices. And then finally, at the top of the slide there, the FNPRM. The Commission, in addition to everything it's already done and having to deal with the challenges and having to deal with the AFC implementation and all of those, it also still has pending rules related to very low power unlicensed operations, the potential for increased transmit power for indoor devices, and then standard power mobile operations as well. So lots more to come, I'm sure, in the following year for 6 gigahertz. One we haven't touched on yet, but I thought would be interesting for this group is the 10 gigahertz band. This is one that is actually being discussed as part of the WRC process for the international coordination. It has a petition for rulemaking over at the FCC that has not yet been docketed. So the Commission has not yet sought comment on this one, but again, thought it would be interesting. So a coalition sort of renewed this issue last year, coming back from an item that was actually an idea that was put out there by Mimosa Networks back in 2013, which was to make the band available and to seek allocation for that 500 megahertz for point-to-point use on a shared basis with the federal uses in the band. This one currently allocated for radio location and amateur uses in the US, but internationally in 2 other regions, there are mobile and fixed uses that are permitted. So this petition is looking to have the FCC take a fresh look at the potential for fixed point-to-point operations in the 10 to 10.5 5 gigahertz band. Interestingly, though, again, because this is one that's subject to a World Radio Communications Conference agenda item, there are conversations here about the fixed use. There are also conversations happening on the international space about whether mobile or 5G could be utilized in that band as well. So not docketed yet, but did want to raise that one given the relevance. 12 to 13 gigahertz, this is one that I hope did not skip your radar because it is actually on the FCC's open meeting agenda for this Thursday. So the commission here is combining two items that have been pending for a few years on two different band segments. The 12.2 to 12.7, which is currently allocated on a non-federal primary basis for DBS for fixed services and for NGSO fixed satellite services. And then the 12.7 to 13.25, which has primary services for fixed links like BAS and CARS, as well as FSS. The request in the 12.2 to 12.7 was to seek mobile use of the band, and then 12.7 to 13.25, the FCC had put out an inquiry to see, what would be in the art of the possible in terms of making that available for more flexible use. The item that the FCC is poised to adopt on Thursday, on the first part, would deny the mobile operations, but it is seeking comment on terrestrial fixed or potentially unlicensed use of the band. And then for 13 gigahertz, it is moving forward with its opportunities for flexible use of the band, and it's requiring broadcast auxiliary service licensees to provide some additional information on their uses of the band so that there can be an assessment of the incumbent equities. There have been some calls for CARS licensees to have to provide that information as well. This one I think will be interesting to follow. We've got a lot of equities in terms of some of the commercial wireless licensees looking for exclusively licensed opportunities in the band, and then others looking for more dynamically shared pieces. So that'll move to an NPRM. We should see activity on that here in the coming months. 60 gigahertz, I just want to note quickly, this is also one on the FCC's open meeting agenda item, so I thought I'd highlight it. The band is allocated currently for unlicensed devices, but there have been conversations and waivers made available for making that band available for field disturbance sensors in a mobile opportunity and at higher powers. These are things like you think about the hot car sensors, the sensors that go in the backseat of your car and they tell you if your kid's still in the car so you don't leave them in there. So the commission is opening up the band for expanded FDS operations as part of the item that it's adopting at its what are we in now? May open meeting agenda. There have been substantial conversations on that one, though, about coordination with the current unlicensed users, particularly WiGig, in sort of figuring out how all of that's going to work together. And then finally, on the recent updates, this was noted earlier, but the commission did take a fresh look at receiver immunity performance as well. This was one I'm sure folks in the room are very well aware has come and gone periodically over the past 2 decades. The FCC has taken a look, the CSMAC has taken a look, the TAC has taken a look, the White House has taken a look. Everyone is trying to figure out a better path forward to make sure that both parts of the conversation are part of the conversation. The FCC has long looked at the transmitter side, but receivers, of course, are important as well. Trying to think about not only the equities of the folks that have deployed those receivers and have put in money in investment, but also making sure that we're keeping open opportunities to fully use the spectrum landscape. So the policy statement that the FCC adopted is exactly that. It's a policy statement, which means it is not binding rules. What the FCC plans to do is actually use it to inform its further rulemakings in other proceedings. And I think one of the key takeaways from this one is that there were a lot of differences of opinion about what to do and what the FCC should do in that proceeding, whether it should adopt wholesale receiver standards, whether it should do nothing at all, whether it was specific to some industries or others. But I think everyone in the record basically agreed that an all or nothing, all of the above approach does not work for receiver performance. It has to be more of a case-by-case basis depending on what band you're looking at, what equipment you're looking at, those types of things. So I think that was the goal of what the FCC ultimately did. It indicated this guidance that it will look at both sides of the equation, the transmitter and the receiver. As I think Mark noted earlier, the commission did recognize that interference is not a zero-sum game, that there has to be kind of a conversation about what is palatable and what can be tolerated. And Commissioner Symington, who is the one who largely led up this effort, indicated in his statement when this was adopted that he is hoping that the FCC will adopt broader rules, and he actually called it band-specific performance boundaries. He's hoping for more band-specific conversations about receiver performance and transmitter performance moving forward. So I think this one will inform a number of other proceedings. It's not specific to anything today, but it will, I think, come up more and more as we look to, again, share the environment. So those were the substantial recent updates. Two that I wanted to touch on in terms of what we'll continue to see in addition to all of those throughout the rest of the year are the FCC Auction Authority, the National Spectrum Strategy, and then the WRC. And that's three. I'm sorry, I miscounted. So I mentioned earlier the FCC Auction Authority actually expired on March 9th. It was the first time since 1993 when Auction Authority was first given that it actually expired. It had been extended 5 times in the history since 1993, but it's actually been extended 4 more times since September of last year. A number of sort of short-term continuing resolutions to keep the FCC going while also trying to figure out what the next steps were going to be. The big distinctions here, there were some proponents that were looking to get the auction authority extended with specific bands included, so to have a spectrum pipeline as part of that auction authority. Others were looking for just a blanket extension and sort of give the FCC that authority on whatever bands it sort of picks. So you could see the equities on either side. Having a roadmap certainly gives people the opportunity to know what's coming down the pike. It allows the band to score differently. At the same time, opening up more broadly kind of gives the FCC a little more discretion. So that is the crux of what the debate has been. There have been also a number of discussions about what to do with 3 gigahertz, given that it's already subject to legislation and has to be investigated. So that was a big part of the contention as well. But it is important to get it renewed. The FCC has held more than 100 auctions in its history since 1993, brought in over $200 billion to the US Treasury, and that's not even including the investment from building out that spectrum as well. So important to get that moving, and I'm sure some of those 2.5 licensees would be thinking the same. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that one and see what Congress ends up doing in order to get the FCC that authorization. And in the meantime, see if the FCC provides any further guidance on the scope of its authority absent that extension. The next one, underlying, I think, everything that we'll talk about throughout the conference is the National Spectrum Strategy, and certainly Scott Harris coming tomorrow to chat about that. This is substantial. NTIA taking a look at potentially evaluating 1,500 megahertz of spectrum for potential repurposing. It was a very steep record. About 140 commenters came in this proceeding with a variety of different ideas on how to utilize different spectrum bands, what spectrum bands to target, what type of sharing to utilize, those types of things. And then ultimately NTIA is indicating that it will develop its roadmap potentially by November, we've heard, but hopefully Scott has more news on that tomorrow, so I'll be keeping an eye out for that. And then they have an implementation plan that they'll be doing as part of that as well. So, not a ton of surprises, I don't think, if you took a look at the record. People were mostly kind of along the lines that you would expect in terms of clearing spectrum as a priority and then sharing in a static way rather than dynamically where possible. That was the sort of commercial wireless stakeholder position. And then you had folks that were taking a look at very interesting and novel sharing approaches and coordination, enhancements to the CBRS framework or the AFC, what have you, and then a number of researchers and others as well. So it was an interesting docket to take a look at, to be perfectly frank, and I'll be curious to see what comes out of that one. I think one final core theme that came out of this strategy that's worth noting is one point of agreement amongst the various commenters, which is that coordination is key, making sure that the government is coordinated as new spectrum bands are being made available. 7 to 16, I'll just touch on very quickly to say this was part of a range that the chairwoman has been talking about for about a year or so now, not just for 5G, but for 6G as well. So we'll continue to see activity here. We talked a little bit about some of those, 12 and 10 gigahertz, for instance. 7 gigahertz is a substantial one as well. Lots of federal users and alphabet soup of agencies there. But folks have been taking a look at potentially making it available for licensed use, but also potentially extending that 6 gigahertz range, another 125 megahertz for more unlicensed as well. And then finally, I know this is quick, WRC is right around the corner, so the delegation will be heading out to Dubai in November and December of this year. I marked up there 2 of the key agenda items from our perspective, taking a look at agenda item 1.2, which has 5 frequency ranges, potentially for international investigation. The FCC right now supports the 3.6 to 3.8, not surprisingly, for IMT use, international mobile telecommunications. It's looking for a no change on the 2 6 gigahertz ones with regard to unlicensed opportunities, and then 10 gigahertz and 3 gigahertz are very much still up in the air in terms of what the U.S. position is going to be. 3 gigahertz obviously important to that lower 3 gigahertz discussion. And then agenda item 10 is really the forward-looking one for WRC 27 and taking a look at that 7 to 15 gigahertz range. So I have left no time for questions, which is exactly what I wanted to do. But it's up to you if you want to take.
Yeah, if we have a question, this is the time. Dr. Willis.
Yes, thanks, Joe. All right, I just was wondering if you might have any insights into an issue that's been kicking around with the FCC for quite some time now, and that's what's going on in the 70, 80 gigahertz E-band with the FCC. It seems like they've kind of been glommed onto a giant omnibus thing that they're looking at there, but it doesn't seem to ever move anywhere. Just curious if you have any insight into that.
I think you're spot on exactly what happened is it's glommed onto a bunch of other things that got contentious, that kind of everything got lumped in together for the ones that could have been easier to move. That was, I think, what's happened over the past 2 years on that, 3 years now, I think, oh my gosh, since the request was made. So this 70, 80, 90 gigahertz band, there was a request made to enhance the use of the band for backhaul that I think has been glommed onto another, just a bunch of other things that are happening in the 70, 80, 90 gigahertz band that I have not seen any activity on it, unfortunately, but if I do, I'm happy to let you know.
Thank you.
Yes.
Give a big hand to
All right.
Grace.
Thank you.